We are constantly told that our worth is measured by our output, by the emails we send, the projects we complete, or the hours we log. Success has become synonymous with motion, perpetual forward movement, ceaseless optimization, and maximum efficiency. We live in a culture of busyness, where exhaustion itself is often mistaken for virtue, and genuine rest can feel like a moral failure. We are told that if we just optimize enough, streamline hard enough, or simply hustle harder, the perfect life, the meaningful, fulfilling one, will finally arrive. But what if this entire pursuit, this relentless philosophy of productivity, has fundamentally misunderstood what a meaningful life actually is? This essay aims to challenge the very metric by which modern society measures human value. We are not just discussing time management hacks or organizational apps, we are engaging in a deep philosophical deconstruction of productivity itself. What we find is that this concept is less an objective description of labor and more a potent, deeply ingrained cultural myth, the myth of constant motion. It suggests that the self is primarily a resource to be managed, maximized, and liquidated for economic gain. We will begin by defining productivity not merely as task completion, but as a dominant philosophical framework that equates intense effort with intrinsic value. By examining this relationship through the lens of modern capitalism, we will ask some difficult questions. Has our obsession with optimizing our time fundamentally detached our human identity from anything other than our labor? When does the act of working cease to be an expression of self and become nothing more than a performance designed for external validation? Over the next 45 minutes, we will navigate the chasm between what we do and who we are. We will explore how this relentless focus on output, this commodification of our time and attention, has created a profound philosophical paradox, that in their desperate attempt to achieve more, we risk losing everything that makes life truly worth living. Our central question, therefore, is not simply how to be more productive, but rather, what happens when we decide to redefine the very measure of a successful human existence? We must ask if there is any way to reclaim our sense of inherent worth outside the relentless tyranny of the checklist and the corporate KPI. We are so conditioned to believe that value is transactional. We learn early in life, through the rituals of school, work, and social expectation, that if we are not producing, consuming, or optimizing, then we are somehow lacking. Our worth becomes inextricably linked to our utility. The metric, therefore, ceases to be a measure of mere output, the number of tasks checked off by the end of the day, and transforms into an identity marker: I am what I produce. This is perhaps the most insidious shift in modern Western philosophy, one that has taken the practical concept of labor and elevated it into a foundational dogma about the human soul. We have internalized the notion that our existence requires continuous justification through visible contribution. To deeply understand this cultural obsession with measurable output, we must engage with what philosopher Aristotle called telos, or ultimate purpose. Traditionally, telos was understood as the inherent end goal of something, the reason a thing exists. For an axe, its telos is to chop wood. For a human being, in classical understanding, the telos was often associated with reaching eudaimonia. Now, when we examine this term, many people assume it simply means happiness, but that is a profound oversimplification. True eudaimonia, as Aristotle described it, is not a fleeting emotional state. It is not merely feeling good after completing a large project or receiving a promotion. It is an objective state of human flourishing achieved through the habitual exercise of reason and virtue over an entire lifetime. The subtle yet catastrophic point of divergence here lies in how modern productivity culture has corrupted that grand, contemplative idea into something drastically smaller, something immediate, and crucially, economic. Today's definition of flourishing is not found in virtuous contemplation or deep skill mastery. It is found in the visible accumulation of bullet points on a quarterly report. We have replaced the slow, arduous cultivation of character, the kind of self-work that requires stillness to observe patterns of behavior and moral choice, with the frantic, urgent execution of tasks designed solely to generate positive metrics for stakeholders who are rarely, if ever, concerned with our actual state of being. Think about the mechanics of this replacement. If Aristotle believed the highest human function was rational contemplation, thereby distinguishing us from other animals, modern productivity demands that we treat even contemplation as a form of deep work that must be scheduled and optimized, a block on a calendar to be defended against distraction. The moment contemplation becomes a task with an assigned time slot, it loses its essential nature. It moves from being an organic overflow of a rich life into another item requiring completion before the next urgent meeting can begin. This is where the philosophical danger truly lies. We are mistaking activity for meaning. We confuse motion with progress. The sheer volume of inputs, the emails answered, the meetings attended, the lines of code written, the pages drafted, becomes a proxy for depth of thought or moral integrity. If you fill your day with enough impressive-sounding activities, the internal voice whispering doubts about your purpose is silenced by the noise of self-imposed busyness. The hustle culture, therefore, is not merely an economic phenomenon, it is a profoundly successful psychological operation that requires us to confuse exhaustion with virtue. Consider the historical shifts in labor value. Historically, many societies valued craftsmanship, the slow mastery of a physical art, like glassblowing or carpentry. These crafts required deep time investment and often connected the artisan's worth directly to their skill, which was both personal and inherently valuable. When industrialization arrived, that personalized measure of worth was shattered. The system shifted to valuing scale, speed, and replicability, the assembly line model. Today, we are experiencing a digital version of that break. Our unique human skills are being digitized, commodified, and reduced to quantifiable data points, KPIs. Our intrinsic value is measured not by the quality of our insight or the depth of our empathy, but by how efficiently we can process information provided by algorithms and how quickly we can execute instructions given by optimizing managers. The philosophical question that looms large in this vacuum is, what if the very system designed to measure our worth has systematically blinded us to the things that cannot be measured? What about boredom? Boredom, which modern culture treats like a disease to be immediately medicated with consumption or stimulation, might actually be the necessary precondition for genuine philosophical breakthrough. It is in the quiet void of unstructured time, the moment when there are no urgent notifications and no mandatory tasks, that the mind finally has the space to wander back to its inherent self, away from the dictates of the marketplace. The profound realization we must cultivate is that our worth as human beings precedes any labor contract, any quarterly earnings report, or any number on a productivity dashboard. Our capacity for wonder, our ability to grieve deeply, our spontaneous acts of kindness, these are all high-value functions that generate zero positive metrics and thus remain invisible to the current system of valuation. To live philosophically is to start treating these unmeasurable goods, the quiet moments, the deep relationships, the willingness to simply be without purpose, not as luxuries to be afforded only after productivity demands have been met, but as the primary, non-negotiable source of our being. It requires a radical refusal to accept that perpetual motion is synonymous with meaningful life. This brings us to the necessary confrontation: if true being is found in stillness and connection, in the willingness to simply exist without an immediate quota of tasks completed, then what exactly are we celebrating when we praise hyper-efficiency? We mistake the symptom of a fulfilled life for its actual substance. The modern productivity ethos operates on a fundamentally faulty premise, that human value is derived from external, measurable outputs. It has engineered a system where the self is reduced to an economic unit, a processor of tasks, whose worth correlates directly with its utilization rate. This reductionist view ignores the vast and complex territory of human existence, our emotional lives, our capacity for contemplation, our sheer potentiality simply existing. To critique productivity philosophically, we must first distinguish between mere activity and actual flourishing, a distinction so fundamental that it separates the concerns of modern self-help culture from the deep traditions of classical thought. The most potent counter-narrative to this relentless metric comes from Aristotle. When he spoke of eudaimonia, often translated as human flourishing or living well, he was not speaking merely of happiness, nor even of professional success in the modern sense. He posited a concept that is far deeper and more demanding. It is an activity, yes, but crucially, it must be the unique activity proper to human beings, the continuous exercise of reason toward excellence. For Aristotle, flourishing did not mean having enough money or completing enough tasks. It meant living in accordance with virtue and realizing one's highest potential through thoughtful action and rational deliberation over a sustained period of time. The key philosophical move here is that eudaimonia is an internal state achieved through external practice. It is an integrated lifestyle, not a destination point reached by checking off the last item on a to-do list. Contrast this with the prevailing productivity ideology today. Our system treats success as a linear accumulation of credentials and assets. First, get the degree, next, climb the corporate ladder, then, buy the house, finally, retire into, and ideally fund, a state of earned leisure. The promise is that once the necessary external metrics are met, the promotion, the salary band, the title, then you will have earned the right to be content and reflective. This structure fundamentally misunderstands human nature because it makes peace a reward, rather than recognizing peace as an integral condition for sustainable action itself. We are taught to approach our own souls like poorly maintained machinery that requires constant oiling with achievement. This framework of perpetual external validation is deeply rooted in Enlightenment-era industrial capitalism. While the Enlightenment championed reason and individual agency, it simultaneously birthed a relentless commodification of time. Time ceased to be viewed as a resource for contemplative life, as Plato understood it, where deep questioning was the ultimate activity, and became merely a fungible input into the production machine. We moved from valuing being to valuing doing, and doing became inextricably linked to generating profit. Consider the Stoics, another school of thought immensely relevant here. While often misinterpreted as advocates for extreme emotional suppression or ruthless efficiency, their core philosophy offers a radical critique of our focus on external outcomes. Marcus Aurelius spent his life grappling with how to maintain inner peace, a state entirely independent of whether Rome was at war, whether the Senate approved of him, or whether he finished writing his daily reflections before sunrise. His teachings guide us toward distinguishing what lies within our sphere of control, our judgments, our responses, our character, from what does not, the economy, geopolitical events, the demands of a demanding boss. Productivity culture, by its very nature, forces us to focus almost exclusively on the latter, on external controls and measurable results. It encourages us to expend precious psychological energy worrying about variables that are fundamentally outside our virtuous reach. The Stoic model proposes instead a radical reframing. True freedom comes not from achieving more milestones, but from mastering one's judgment of those milestones. The moment we accept the premise that my worth equals my output, we concede to external forces, the market, the algorithm, the demanding boss, the keys to our internal peace. We become perpetually anxious performance artists whose curtain never drops. To truly recover a philosophy of life from this industrial straitjacket, we must therefore adopt a philosophical posture of reorientation. It involves resisting the inherent compulsion to treat every moment as a data point requiring optimization. It means recognizing that the highest form of productivity might not be writing the most lines of code or attending the most meetings. It might simply be the cultivation of sustained attention, the ability to sit with a difficult thought, to listen fully without formulating a rebuttal, or to allow the mind the luxury of unstructured wandering. This is not laziness, this is the highest form of cognitive labor, the bedrock upon which genuine creativity and profound wisdom must be built. It is the recovery of the capacity for telos in its truest sense, not just an end goal, the corner office, but a fulfillment that arises from the integrated process of living well, thoughtfully, and virtuously, even when no measurable metric is watching to score our performance. The deepest challenge posed by this capitalist valuation system is not merely one of time management, it is an unprecedented systemic alienation from our own intrinsic rhythms, a profound commodification of what was once considered non-marketable, attention. Our lives have been reduced to a continuous stream of data points, and the currency we are most ruthlessly forced to generate today is not labor hours in a factory, but sustained engagement within digital platforms and corporate structures. This shift represents one of the most subtle yet devastating philosophical shifts since the Industrial Revolution, for it has turned our very cognitive capacity, our ability to focus, to reflect, to merely be, into a marketable asset. We are now participating in what might be termed the attention economy, where the greatest commodity is not gold or oil, but focused consciousness itself. To understand how this functions, we must look beyond simple economic models and grasp the psychosocial architecture of perpetual availability. Our worth becomes inextricably tied to our responsiveness. The phone vibrating, the email notification blinking, these are not merely signals, they are miniature demands for immediate cognitive surrender. They enforce a state of hypervigilance that prevents the deep, meandering thought necessary for true philosophical reflection or creative insight. We have internalized the belief that any moment spent idle is not neutral, but actively detrimental to our social standing and professional trajectory. This manufactured anxiety around idleness is perhaps the most effective tool of modern productivity culture. It transforms what Aristotle called skol, or leisure, the necessary time for contemplation and self-cultivation, into a moral failing, something shameful that must be aggressively filled with optimization activities, whether those are guided meditations followed by networking calls, or informational consumption designed to make us feel intellectually superior while consuming our remaining minutes. Historically, periods of true philosophical flourishing were predicated on geographic isolation, the presence of dedicated leisure classes, think of the Athenian gymnasium or the monastery, and the structural protection of deep time, the ability to simply wait for an idea to mature. These conditions are fundamentally incompatible with the modern networked life. We live in a state of permanent partial distraction, where our attention is fractured across dozens of potential stimuli. The consequence is not merely scattered focus, it is a degradation of depth itself. As thinkers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty have observed regarding embodiment and experience, true meaning arises from inhabiting a coherent self within a continuous narrative. The constant pings and segmented tasks disrupt the very continuity necessary for us to build that foundational sense of self. We become collections of reactive segments rather than integrated beings capable of sustained introspection. Furthermore, this commodification extends beyond mere digital attention into our emotional bandwidth. Emotional labor, the requirement to manage not just our own feelings, but also the perceived emotions and states of others in order to maintain social or professional harmony, has been rebranded as a core skill of modern professionalism. We are taught that emotional resilience, positive affirmation, and instant psychological availability are not signs of healthy being, but marketable competencies essential for career advancement. This turns the deep, messy work of human care into another quantifiable KPI, key performance indicator. The empathetic response is logged, the supportive conversation is measured against its perceived utility. The philosophical implication here is profound. If our capacity to feel empathy or maintain mental equilibrium can be quantified and leveraged by an employer, then these capacities cease being inherent aspects of our humanity and become merely input variables for a profit-generating machine. We are discouraged from experiencing boredom because it implies nothing is needed, we are pressured into constant micro-activities that simulate engagement without generating actual telos. To resist this deeply embedded structure requires understanding its origins. It is not simply the failure of individual willpower, but the success of an infrastructural paradigm that has made true solitude and deep reflection increasingly difficult, if not materially impossible. The modern ideal citizen must appear perpetually busy, they must demonstrate a visible commitment to optimizing their marginal utility in every waking moment. To deviate from this pattern, to simply sit with a thought, or to engage in non-productive, purely aesthetic contemplation, is often met with suspicion, treated as a deficit of drive, or worse, framed pathologizingly as symptoms of burnout, thereby reinforcing the very productivity culture it attempts to critique. Therefore, if genuine fulfillment demands an architecture built not upon measurable output but on sustained depth, then the central philosophical battleground is no longer the boardroom, but the quiet space between notifications, the recovered capacity for Skoll, understood not as a luxury of time, but as the essential nutrient required for the authentic self to finally breathe and reconsider what it means to simply exist without justification. If Stoicism offers us the intellectual framework for remembering where our true locus of control resides, that internal landscape of judgment and response, utterly distinct from the unpredictable chaos of external market forces or social expectations, then what precisely does it mean to live a life governed by such an inner compass? The classical Stoics, particularly figures like Epictetus, did not offer us a simple manifesto for quitting your job, rather, they offered a radical reorientation of attention. Their philosophy is built upon the fundamental distinction between things that are up to us and things that are not up to us. This division was nothing short of revolutionary in its simplicity and profound difficulty, demanding not merely resignation, but disciplined intellectual action. To be Stoic, in its purest sense, is to train oneself to accept the reality of external contingency, the illness, the loss of wealth, the failure of a project, the capriciousness of human approval, while reserving one's entire energy for perfecting the only thing that genuinely belongs to us, our own judgment. We are perpetually bombarded by a culture that elevates outcome above virtue, where the metric of success is always quantifiable and externalized, the quarterly earnings report, the number of followers, the promotion title. This cultural imperative trains us to feel incomplete, flawed, or unworthy until we have acquired the next achievement, the next external marker of status. But the Stoic challenge forces a radical decoupling. It asks us to consider if our sense of self-worth is genuinely tethered to the volatile fluctuations of the marketplace, or if it can be anchored in something immutable, the consistent practice of rationality and moral excellence. Consider Marcus Aurelius, whose meditations are not philosophical treatises meant for public consumption but private journals written by a man governing one of the most sprawling, complex empires the world had ever known. His meditations reveal a constant struggle to remind himself that his true job, when the weight of legions and political machinations rested upon him, was simply to act justly, to reason calmly, and to accept what he could not change with dignity. This is productivity redefined. It is not about maximizing widgets or minimizing wasted minutes, it is about minimizing internal contradiction, the space between what we know to be true, that our peace depends on our character, and how we choose to react when faced with the overwhelming demands of modern life. The sheer weight of this shift can feel paralyzing, because in a world that constantly rewards visible exertion and rapid response, dedicating oneself to the quiet, untelevised work of internal virtue seems almost anticlimactic. It suggests a kind of profound stillness, a refusal to participate in the frantic, exhausting spectacle of perpetually becoming more. But this stillness is not inertia, it is disciplined power. It is the strength that comes from knowing that even if every external indicator of your life, your career, your relationships, your financial stability, were stripped away by misfortune or systemic failure, your inner moral compass would remain uncompromised because its function depends only upon you. This deep philosophical dive into internal sovereignty offers a powerful counter-narrative to the relentless grind culture. It suggests that perhaps the most productive thing we can do with our finite time is not to earn more, but to think better, not to move faster, but to judge clearer. The Stoic ideal forces us to recognize that true freedom, the kind of freedom worth yearning for, is not attained when we finally achieve financial independence or perfect work-life balance, which are themselves external, mutable goals, but when we realize that our emotional and intellectual autonomy can withstand the collapse of all those superficial supports. It is the radical acceptance of limits, acknowledging that while we cannot control the economy, we can control whether panic becomes a decision. While we cannot control other people's opinions, we can control the generosity with which we choose to listen. This practice of internal triage, of relentlessly distinguishing between the things necessary for our moral health and the distractions masquerading as necessity, is perhaps the most difficult, yet most profound, act of self-mastery a human being can undertake. It demands that we treat our attention not as a resource to be constantly drained by stimuli, but as a precious commodity to be guarded fiercely, invested only in those thoughts, actions, and relationships which genuinely contribute to the cultivation of character. This is the subtle, revolutionary promise of Skoll. It is not merely the absence of work, it is the active space required for philosophical self-auditing, allowing us to move from a life lived purely on reaction, a flurry of performative productivity driven by fear and external expectation, to a life governed instead by considered principle. What this resistance, the conscious decision to value depth over breadth, reflection over sheer output, is not merely a lifestyle suggestion, it is an ontological challenge. It requires us to resist the deep, pervasive modern instinct to quantify everything we do and even who we are doing it for. We must learn to distinguish between what is valuable because it produces something marketable or measurable, and what is inherently valuable simply by existing as a space of contemplation, connection, or pure process. This brings us to the philosophical weight of meaning itself. When productivity becomes the dominant metric, meaning often gets reduced to utility. A life that is meaningful must be useful. If we adopt this framework, that our worth derives from our capacity to contribute quantifiable value in a capitalist sense, then moments spent simply reading for pleasure, wandering without destination, or engaging in conversation purely for the sake of shared humanity, are not just beneficial, they become morally suspect. They appear as waste, as slack time that fails to justify its existence in the ledger of achievement. The modern obsession with efficiency, which is really an obsession with minimizing perceived waste, forces us into a perpetual state of preemptive justification. We feel obliged to optimize our downtime, to find productive leisure, the kind of hobby that can eventually be monetized or presented on a resume as evidence of disciplined self-improvement. This cycle creates a vicious feedback loop. The goal is not enjoyment for its own sake, but the accrual of good credentials which, in turn, fuels further productivity expectations. The emotional residue of this constant performance fatigue is exhaustion, a profound state that science accurately identifies as an energy deficit, but philosophy must interpret as a crisis of self-definition. To break out of this trap, we need to adopt a philosophical framework that actively resists the measurement itself. We must invoke what I call the economics of non-output. This is not about slacking off, it is about consciously allocating time and energy toward activities whose return on investment cannot be calculated in dollars, but rather in terms of resilience, depth of understanding, or genuine emotional connection. Consider the Socratic method. At its core, it is profoundly unproductive by modern standards. Socrates did very little that could be immediately quantified. He spent his life asking questions that often had no single correct answer and which actively destabilized the established belief systems of Athenian society. His contribution was not a novel treatise or an invention, it was a persistent act of intellectual disruption, forcing others to confront the fact that they didn't actually know what they thought they knew. The value lay entirely in the process of self-doubt, the uncomfortable friction of inquiry, which is perhaps the most difficult commodity to sell in a metrics-driven economy. This echoes the Stoic understanding of virtue, too. For thinkers like Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus, true excellence, virtue, was not an external achievement, like winning a battle or accumulating wealth, but an internal state, the mastery of one's own judgment and desires. The virtuous act is therefore fundamentally non-productive in any commercial sense, it is purely self-directed. It asks us to turn our focus inward, shifting the measure of success from what we do for others, to who we are becoming within ourselves. The difficulty here lies in the fact that contemporary culture has institutionalized external validation. Our social media profiles, our corporate annual reviews, even our university transcripts, all function as miniature, personalized productivity metrics. They are highly visible, easily digestible forms of quantified self-worth. We have become accustomed to performing for an audience of algorithms and peers who demand constant evidence of upward trajectory. The sheer volume of this performative existence is breathtakingly draining because it demands that we constantly manage the narrative of our own value. Therefore, the philosophical task ahead, the ultimate resistance against the tyranny of productivity, is a radical act of self-redefinition. It means learning to sit with ambiguity. It means embracing the profound inefficiency of deep contemplation. It means recognizing that the most valuable human activity is not problem-solving for an external entity, but solving the existential problems for oneself, the questions about purpose, belonging, and meaning that cannot be answered by a quarterly report or a successful launch date. This shift requires us to treat our own minds not as processing units to be constantly optimized for maximum throughput, but as gardens that require seasonal neglect, deep root nourishment, and the occasional space left fallow. To prioritize this intellectual dormancy is to participate in a revolt against the tyranny of perpetual motion, recognizing that the most profound form of productivity is often simply the ability to be fully present, unjustified, unoptimized, and entirely for oneself. This leads us finally to the question of radical acceptance. What happens when we refuse the premise that every moment must yield a measurable return? If we accept the inherent value in the idle mind, the unstructured walk, or the hours spent simply observing a cloud drifting across an indifferent sky, we are doing more than just resting, we are engaging in a profound act of epistemic refusal. We are refusing to participate in the cult of efficiency that suggests that a blank moment is synonymous with a wasted opportunity. The deepest intellectual reward often comes not from solving a problem, but from grappling with its sheer complexity, a process that has no immediate application and therefore yields zero quantifiable output on any modern corporate key performance indicator. This resistance echoes some of history's most enduring philosophical traditions. Consider the ancient Greek concept of eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or the good life. While contemporary interpretations frequently reduce this to achieving material success or optimizing one's career trajectory, the original understanding was something far more encompassing and profoundly rooted in self-actualization achieved through virtue and contemplation. Aristotle understood that human beings possess a capacity for rational thought, but he also recognized that true flourishing required cultivating habits that were often slow, meandering, and deeply inefficient by modern standards. The vita contemplativa, the contemplative life, was not merely an intermission between periods of intellectual labor, it was considered a necessary component of the human soul's development. To neglect contemplation is to risk becoming a highly skilled automaton, capable of prodigious output, yet lacking in genuine self-awareness or internal resonance. The modern crisis of productivity demands that we reintroduce this contemplative space into our operational models. We must understand boredom not as a symptom of inefficiency demanding immediate distraction, be it scrolling through social media feeds or scheduling another low-stakes commitment, but as a generative vacuum. Boredom, in its purest form, is the mind's signal that the current input stream is insufficient. It is the psychic space where novel connections are made and creative breakthroughs often germinate. It is in this fertile emptiness that we allow our subconscious to process the data of our lived experience, connecting disparate dots that the hyper-focused, task-oriented self actively ignores. This idea finds resonance in figures who deliberately withdrew from the transactional demands of society. Think of Thoreau at Walden Pond, not merely escaping his debts, but escaping the very metrics by which capitalist society measured worth, the acquisition treadmill. His experiment was a radical declaration that freedom lay not in accumulating more goods or credentials, but in minimizing external dependencies to maximize internal resonance. He proved that one could possess everything necessary for a meaningful life with almost nothing, thereby dismantling the foundational myth of endless accumulation. To fully embrace this philosophy of sufficiency, the realization that enough is a state of being, not an achieved KPI, requires us to engage in what might be called the practice of philosophical deceleration. This doesn't mean quitting our jobs or moving into a cabin, it means radically restructuring our attention. It means deliberately creating friction against the flow of constant connectivity and optimization. It means accepting that some tasks will take longer than necessary, simply because the value derived is not monetary, but existential, the fulfillment of deep curiosity, the slow process of mastering an archaic craft, or the patience required to genuinely listen to another person without formulating a rebuttal in the interim. Furthermore, we must confront the inherent danger of performative productivity. This is the exhausting performance of busyness, the constant need to appear occupied and valuable simply because our culture has attached a monetary price tag to visible effort. The truly productive mind, the one that operates from a place of genuine internal calibration, understands that value is derived not from the sheer volume of hours logged or the number of emails answered, but from the depth and quality of intention applied to tasks, a concept far more demanding and difficult than simply maintaining an impressive schedule. Therefore, our final philosophical shift must be one of ownership. We must move away from viewing ourselves as mere inputs in a giant economic machine, designed only for extraction and output. Instead, we must begin treating our consciousness as its own valuable resource, a finite, sacred space that requires maintenance, deep rest, and non-judgmental contemplation. This is not merely self-care, it is an ethical imperative, a necessary reorientation of the human relationship with time itself. The great irony of this